If I close my eyes, I can still picture that last Christmas at the villa, the one that ended everything I thought I knew. Palm Beach has a way of shining brighter in December. The winter sun pouring over the ocean like liquid gold, soft breezes rustling through the palms. That year, the villa looked more beautiful than ever. The white stucco walls were wrapped in golden fairy lights, flickering softly as twilight fell. My mother's tall fir tree, the one she'd always insisted on, even in Florida's heat, stood proud in the sunroom, its branches dripping with glass ornaments collected from all over Europe and America. Growing up, I believed I had a perfect life, or at least a life that looked perfect from the outside. My mother, Lorraine Thompson, had passed away 3 years earlier, leaving the villa to me. She had always said, "Bella, this house is your home. It will keep you safe long after I'm gone." I clung to her words, especially at Christmas, when memories seemed to hang in the air like the smell of pine and cinnamon. The villa was more than walls and marble floors. It was my mother's laughter echoing through the halls, the soft sound of her singing old carols as she baked gingerbread in the kitchen, the way she'd gather everyone in the great room for one last story before bed. This year, though, there was a shadow over everything. My father, Gregory Thompson, had been acting strangely for weeks. He seemed short-tempered, avoiding my questions, never looking me quite in the eye. Gregory was never an easy man, but lately, he felt like a stranger in our home. I tried to brush it off as stress. Christmas parties at the villa were a grand affair, and the guest list this year was longer than ever. People came from all over Florida, from Miami's wealthy circles to the old money of Boston. The house buzzed with voices and clinking glasses, the sound of laughter and the sharp scent of mulled wine filling the air. Yet beneath it all, I felt uneasy. There were little things, a coldness in Gregory's tone, a secretive whisper with his lawyer, Mr. Bennett, in the study. I caught them both looking at me more than once, their conversations stopping abruptly whenever I entered the room. Still, I tried to make the most of the night. I dressed in my mother's favorite red velvet dress, the one she'd worn at her last Christmas, and put on the emerald necklace she left me. I smiled at the guests, made small talk, and pretended that everything was just as it always was. It wasn't until late in the evening, when the party was at its peak, that everything changed. The band was playing a slow rendition of Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas, and I was laughing with Emma, my oldest friend, when I heard the sharp clinking of a glass. Gregory stood by the marble fireplace, tall and rigid, his face unreadable in the glow of the flames. The room gradually quieted, all eyes turning to him. He cleared his throat, his voice loud and commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I have something to say." My heart thudded in my chest, uncertain and anxious. For a split second, I wondered if this was some elaborate Christmas toast, maybe even a heartfelt apology for his recent distance. But then he turned to look at me, and I saw nothing but ice in his eyes. "This is not my daughter," he said, his words slicing through the festive air. "This is my wife's illegitimate child." The silence was absolute. I felt the weight of every gaze in the room turn to me, curious, confused, and suddenly judgmental. The words barely made sense at first, echoing in my mind as if I'd misheard him. My cheeks flushed hot, then cold, my hands shaking around the crystal glass I held. The villa, the only true home I'd ever known, suddenly felt foreign, its walls closing in around me. Gregory wasn't finished. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope filled with crisp legal documents. He held them up for everyone to see, like a magician revealing his trick. "As of today, this villa is mine," he declared, his voice hard as steel. "Isabella, you are no longer welcome here." I couldn't speak. My tongue felt glued to the roof of my mouth, my mind spinning. How could this be happening? I trusted him, despite his faults, despite his distance since my mother's death. I looked around the room for help, for someone who knew the truth of who I was and what this house meant. I saw only a sea of confused faces, some embarrassed for me, others hungry for the drama unfolding before them. My eyes dropped to the papers in his hand. I saw my signature scrawled across the bottom of a thick, official-looking page. For a moment, fear clawed at my chest. But then, something else crept in, anger, and a strange, icy sort of clarity. Gregory had always underestimated me. He didn't know about the late nights I'd spent with my mother's lawyers, learning every detail of her estate. He didn't know about the real title deed, or the way my mother had worked so hard to protect me from exactly this kind of betrayal. I could see, even in that moment of humiliation, that he thought he had won. He thought the villa and everything it represented was finally his. But he was wrong. The guests began to murmur, some edging toward the exits, others watching in fascinated silence. Emma caught my eye, her face full of worry and loyalty. I knew she would follow me, no matter what happened. I took a deep breath, willing my voice to be steady. I met Gregory's eyes, refusing to let him see me cry. "If that's how you want it," I said quietly, "then I'll go." Inside, I felt a storm raging, heartbreak and betrayal mixing with a hard, unexpected pride. I turned, handed my glass to a passing server, and walked out of the sunroom, through the grand foyer, and out into the night. The cool air stung my cheeks, the world spinning with the echo of Gregory's accusation. As I stood at the edge of the driveway, the villa glowing behind me, I realized that my life was about to change forever. I had lost everything I thought was mine in a single, brutal moment. But somewhere deep down, I knew this was not the end of my story. It was only the beginning. When I stepped out of my own home on that cold December night, the shock and humiliation were still burning inside me. I stood on the driveway, heels pressed into the brick, and tried to breathe through the chaos swirling in my chest. My father's words kept ringing in my ears, the way he'd called me an illegitimate child in front of people who had toasted my birthdays and sung carols in my living room. For a moment, I thought I might break down and cry right there, let the pain and betrayal wash over me, and leave me hollow. But as the cool air bit at my cheeks, something unexpected happened. Instead of tears, a sharp, cold laugh rose in my throat, a sound I barely recognized as my own. It wasn't a laugh of joy, but of disbelief, of bitter amusement at the absurdity of it all. I realized, in that strange moment of clarity, just how little Gregory truly knew about the world he was trying to steal. He had always been on the outside looking in, even when my mother was alive. He didn't know the secret jokes my mother and I shared, the way we would sneak out for late-night ice cream runs, or how she used to keep her most important documents in an old jewelry box tucked behind a false wall in her closet. He was never a part of our quiet rituals, the Sunday afternoons on the beach, the holiday dinners where laughter drowned out any tension, and especially the night before she died, when she told me in a whisper, "Don't let anyone take away what's yours, Bella. Not even family." That memory, so tender and so fierce, gave me strength as I turned away from the glowing villa and toward the unknown. Emma, faithful as ever, pulled up a minute later in her blue BMW. She rolled down the window, her eyes wide and worried. "Are you okay? What did he say to you?" she asked, voice trembling a little. I slipped into the passenger seat and pulled the door closed, shivering more from adrenaline than the Florida air. I turned to her, my lips curling into a wry smile. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," I said. But I did tell her as we drove away from the only home I'd ever known, the palm trees blurring past. I told her everything, the accusation, the forged signature, the stunned faces of our friends and neighbors. Emma gasped when I finished. "But Bella, that's impossible. Your mom left everything to you. Everyone knows that." She gripped the steering wheel tighter, as if she could steer me back to my old life. I shrugged, still half in shock. "He thinks he's won. He thinks a signature is all it takes. But he doesn't know half as much as he thinks he does." What Gregory never understood, and what no one in that room realized, was that my mother had been a woman who trusted very few people. She had grown up in a world where money meant safety, but also betrayal, and she was always careful, always 3 steps ahead. Gregory married her for her charm and her wealth, but he was never part of her inner circle. I remembered the days after she passed, how he seemed more interested in the lawyers than in comforting me, and how he would sometimes linger by the study door, pretending not to listen as I spoke quietly with my mother's oldest friend, Rebecca Miller. Rebecca was not only my godmother, but a sharp attorney with a reputation that stretched from New York to London. When my mother became ill, she entrusted Rebecca with everything: the will, the property deeds, the bank information, and a letter for me that I was not to open until I turned 25. My mother made sure that no single person, certainly not Gregory, could ever get their hands on all the keys to her estate. I remembered the day I caught Gregory snooping through my things. I had come home early from a trip to the market and found him hunched over my desk, squinting at old birthday cards and letters, some written in my careful teenage handwriting. He jumped when he saw me, muttering something about looking for a receipt. But I noticed the pad of paper where he'd been practicing my signature over and over, his thick fingers pressing grooves into the soft wood of the pencil. I didn't confront him. Instead, I smiled, tucked the memory away, and doubled down on my precautions. That night, sitting in Emma's car, I realized just how pitiful Gregory's plan really was. He must have found some old signature of mine, forged it on the property transfer forms, and convinced himself he was clever enough to fool everyone. But he didn't know the real documents were in Rebecca's Manhattan safe, or that the will he'd seen was a decoy, one my mother had made for exactly this scenario. He had paraded his victory in front of our friends, but he'd only exposed how desperate he was to claim something that was never truly his. As Emma drove us toward her apartment in West Palm Beach, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Rebecca. Saw the news. I'll call you in the morning. Stay strong. Even through the panic and anger, I smiled. I wasn't alone. My mother had made sure of that. That night, lying awake in Emma's guest room, I played every detail over in my mind. I remembered the way Gregory's hands shook slightly as he held up those forged papers, how eager he'd been for the room to accept his truth. For a second, I almost felt sorry for him. He was a man who thought control meant ownership, that money could buy love or loyalty. He didn't understand the difference between taking something and truly belonging. I drifted off to sleep remembering my mother's lessons. Trust your instincts, protect what matters, and never show your hand until the time is right. In the morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The shock was gone, replaced by resolve. I was not going to let him steal my story, or my life. That afternoon, as I sipped coffee with Emma on her balcony, I called Rebecca. She answered on the first ring, her voice brisk and warm. Bella, I've already checked the county records. Nothing's changed. The real deed is safe. I'll handle any lawyers who come sniffing around. You focus on taking care of yourself. For the first time since that awful night, I let myself smile, a real, genuine smile. The joke was on Gregory. He thought he could outsmart me, but he'd only reminded me how much stronger I was than he could ever imagine. So I let him have his little victory for now. Let him brag, let him show off his forged signature and his shallow triumph. He didn't know that everything he tried to steal was still mine, protected by love, foresight, and the kind of family you can't break with lies. And I promised myself, as I watched the sun set over the palm trees, that I would come back. I would take back everything that mattered. And this time, no one would ever take it from me again. Getting kicked out of the villa that night could have been the end of me. The whole drive from the house to Emma's place, I kept looking down at my hands, shaking slightly, fingers tangled in the old wool of my mother's coat. In the pocket was nothing but a crumpled tissue and a small silver key, a useless trinket for the moment. Yet as the tail lights of my old life faded behind us, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a lightness in my chest, a sense of possibility flickering beneath the pain. It was like finally shrugging off a heavy coat after years in the cold. The air stung, but it was my own. Emma's apartment was tiny but warm, filled with the scent of strong coffee and the clutter of real life. Textbooks stacked on the floor, family photos wedged into the mirror frame, a dog-eared copy of To Kill a Mockingbird on the coffee table. She tossed me a blanket and made up the sofa with soft sheets, never asking for explanations or apologies. For the first time in weeks, I slept deeply, knowing that someone was in my corner. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the blinds and the sound of Emma humming in the kitchen. The memories of last night came crashing back, but instead of the choking embarrassment I expected, I felt a strange sense of resolve. I reached for my phone and dialed Rebecca's number in New York. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting for my call. "Rebecca, you won't believe what Gregory tried last night," I said, unable to keep the bitter amusement from my voice. She listened to my story in silence and then burst out laughing. "He really tried that? Bella, don't worry. The real papers are still with me, safe and sound. You're the legal owner of the villa. No forged signature is going to change that." Her confidence was exactly what I needed. I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The fear, the humiliation, even the anger, they all began to shrink as I listened to her calm, assured tone. For the first time since my mother's death, I felt truly protected. Over the next few weeks, my life changed in ways I never expected. Instead of wallowing in heartbreak, I threw myself into action. Rebecca guided me through the maze of legal steps, connecting me with a team of sharp, dedicated attorneys, 2 women and a man, all from her Manhattan firm, who quickly became my lifeline. I paid them each $50,000 from the fund my mother had set aside for emergencies, grateful for her foresight in planning for every possibility. We strategized on conference calls, combing through every piece of evidence, every document, every old photograph that proved my mother's wishes. It was exhausting work, but it gave me purpose. I learned more about my mother in those weeks than I ever had before. Hidden in her files, I found the details of stocks she'd bought in Europe, tiny investments in companies I'd never even heard of, Swedish wind energy, a little British bookstore chain, a vineyard in the French countryside. It was all there in neat folders, each labeled in her careful script. And then there were the bank accounts in Manhattan with balances that made my head spin. I realized that, for all her warmth and laughter, my mother had lived with a kind of quiet caution, always preparing for the worst. There was also the letter she'd left for me, sealed in a blue envelope. I hesitated for days before opening it, afraid of what I might find. But when I finally slid my finger under the flap and unfolded her note, all I felt was love. "Bella, if you're reading this, it means things haven't gone the way I hoped," she'd written. "But I want you to know you are stronger than you realize. Money can protect you, but only if you know who to trust. Let love guide you. Never let bitterness take root. Remember, you are my daughter in every way that matters." Her words steadied me through the meetings, the legal filings, and the court dates that followed. Every time Gregory's lawyers tried to intimidate me or question my place in the world, I pictured my mother standing beside me, her hand on my shoulder, urging me forward. As I worked with Rebecca and my legal team, I started to see my future differently. The villa, for so long the center of my life, became just one piece of a much bigger picture. There was the cozy house in the Hamptons, another gift from my mother, tucked away on a quiet lane, with a wraparound porch and wild roses climbing the fence. I spent weekends there with Emma, letting the salty air and the rhythm of the waves slowly wash away the last traces of fear. Sometimes we'd talk for hours about what I should do next. Other times, we just sat quietly, soaking in the peace. The Hamptons house was a symbol of something I'd almost forgotten. I had options. I had choices. I didn't need to cling to the past or the illusion of family if it meant sacrificing my peace. Money was never the problem, I realized. Trust was. And now I knew exactly who deserved mine. I used some of my newfound freedom to visit New York, walking the bustling streets with Rebecca, feeling anonymous and alive. She introduced me to her friends, writers, artists, women who had built lives on their terms. They welcomed me like an old friend, listening to my story without judgment or pity. For the first time, I started to see myself not as a victim, but as someone who had survived. Someone who could thrive. The legal fight with Gregory dragged on, but I stopped letting it define my days. I set up a small foundation in my mother's name, funding scholarships for young women from Florida who wanted to study law. I began volunteering at a shelter in West Palm Beach, using the privilege I'd been given to make a difference, even in small ways. With every step, I felt my mother's legacy growing stronger, not just in the properties or the money, but in the choices I made. Sometimes, late at night, the old anger would flare up again. I would remember the way Gregory had looked at me that night in the villa, like I was nothing, like he could erase me with a single accusation. But the feeling never lasted long. I had shed that old coat, the weight of his disappointment and betrayal, and found something better in its place. Freedom. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in my life, it was truly mine. Spring came early that year in Palm Beach. The mornings felt softer, and every evening, the sky glowed in colors I'd never noticed before, rose golds and lavender, a gentle hush settling over the ocean at sunset. It was as if the world itself was quietly celebrating the new beginning I hadn't known I needed. My life, for so long defined by the sharp corners of someone else's rules, had turned a page. And for the first time, the story was entirely my own. Gregory's legal battle dragged through winter and into the first sweet weeks of spring. I wish I could say it didn't touch me, that I was above the mess, but the truth is that every summons, every accusation, every attempt by his lawyers to twist my mother's intentions sent tremors through my days. There were moments, late at night, when doubt crept in, when the old ache of betrayal returned. I wondered if somehow, through some loophole or cruel mistake, he might still manage to take everything from me. But as the case unfolded, it became clear that my mother's preparations, her care, her trust in Rebecca, her meticulous way of tying up every loose end, were a shield even in death. The courtroom in Miami was all cold marble and harsh fluorescent lights, but I remember the moment the judge leaned back in his chair and sighed. He shuffled through the real documents, the original deeds, the will in my mother's hand, and finally looked over at Gregory with tired eyes. "Mr. Thompson, these papers speak for themselves. The villa belongs to Ms. Isabella Grace Thompson. This court sees no evidence of fraud, nor any reason to strip her of what her mother intended her to have." Those words echoed in my head for days. In that instant, years of anxiety and grief began to dissolve. Gregory left the courthouse without a word, his face blank and empty. He didn't even look at me. I watched him go, and for the first time, I felt no anger, only a soft, unexpected pity. He had spent so much of his life trying to possess what was never truly his, and now he was left with nothing but his pride. After the verdict, Rebecca and I celebrated in a tiny Miami cafe. She ordered champagne and toasted to my mother's memory, to our stubborn hope and new beginnings. "Your mother would be so proud of you, Bella," she said, her eyes shining. I believed her. With the legal cloud finally lifted, I returned to the villa. At first, it was difficult to walk through those familiar rooms, to touch the walls that had witnessed my pain. The house felt empty, echoing with ghosts of Christmas past and arguments never truly settled. But slowly, with each day, it became mine again. I decided it was time to reclaim not just my inheritance, but my life. I hired a team of designers, women I admired for their boldness and creativity, and together we reimagined the villa. We painted the kitchen a sunny yellow, filled the halls with paintings by local artists, and turned the old study into a library filled with my mother's favorite books and my own. The gardens bloomed with wild roses and lavender, scents drifting in through open windows on breezy afternoons. I hosted small dinners for friends, laughter and music replacing the hush of old secrets. That December, I threw my own Christmas party. This time, the guest list was short and simple. People who loved me, people who had stood by me when I had nothing but doubt and heartbreak. Emma came early to help string lights, her laughter echoing in the hallways. Rebecca arrived from New York with a fresh-cut wreath and a bottle of champagne. There were no lawyers, no fake smiles, no pretenses, just warmth, honesty, and joy. We stood in the living room that night, glasses raised beneath the twinkling lights of the old fir tree. Someone put on a scratchy recording of my mother singing Silent Night, her voice a little off-key, but as pure and comforting as a memory could ever be. For the first time, I truly understood the power of choosing your own family, your own traditions. That Christmas, the house was filled with real love. The emptiness was gone, replaced by hope and a peace I never expected to find. Looking back, I can see that losing everything I thought I needed was the greatest gift I ever received. Without that cold push into the unknown, I might never have discovered what I was capable of. I learned that money is just paper and numbers, useful, but never the measure of a life. What matters is trust, kindness, the courage to start again when you're broken open. I found new strength in the places where I'd once felt weak, new friends in the quiet spaces left by old ones who faded away. The villa became not just a monument to my past, but the foundation of my future. I started a scholarship fund for young women in Palm Beach who wanted to study law, art, or medicine. Anything that called to their hearts. I donated time and money to local shelters, remembering the fear and loneliness of those first nights without a home of my own. Each small act of kindness was a promise to myself. I would not let bitterness define me. I would build something better from all the broken pieces. Sometimes I still think of Gregory, of the look in his eyes as he walked away from the courthouse, pride stripped bare. I hope, in some small way, he found peace. I hope he learned what I had to learn, the hard way, that you cannot own love or legacy or truth. They belong only to those who earn them. Now, as I sit in my sun-filled kitchen with the windows open and the scent of roses drifting in, I feel a deep, quiet gratitude. My life is not perfect, no life ever is, but it is fully, honestly mine. I am Isabella Grace Thompson, daughter of Lorraine, friend to those who stayed, and survivor of the storm that once tried to break me. If you ever think you've lost it all, remember, sometimes that's the beginning of your real life. And if anyone ever tries to take your story, laugh. The truth, like spring in Florida, always finds its way home.